All right, welcome back here to the Gill Athletics Track and Field Connections Podcast. Hey, happy New Year. When you are listening to this, it is 2023. It's hard for a guy who graduated high school in 94 to think about we're in 2023. And just as fun as and exciting as a Happy New Year's, this is our new season. We are blessed that you continue to listen to us and allow us to do season four. We're going to our fourth full year here of interviews of uplifting and honoring coaches around the country. So thank you so much for being here and listening. This podcast literally doesn't happen if we don't have listeners. It also doesn't happen if we don't have an amazing guest. And I've got a good one for you to kick off season 4. Last year, season 3, we kicked off with a personal mentor of mine in coaching in Boo Scheck-Snyder. Well, how about this? I went out and got his mentor. So help me welcome from the Pfaff Sports Consultancy, the wise, the wonderful Mr. Dan Pfaff. Dan, how are you today, sir?
Yeah, doing good. Happy to be here and anxious to see where this goes.
Oh, okay. That makes 2 of us. Good. Dan, it is really a privilege to have you here. You are maybe one of the more prolific coaches out there when it comes to coaching education, writing, blogs, videos, books. It's quite amazing the amount of information you're able to put out in today's world, right now that we have YouTube and Zooms and all that kind of stuff. It's quite amazing. So there are lots of opportunities for coaches out there to learn kind of your coaching style and philosophy. What do you believe in to help a pole vaulter get better, a long jumper get better? And you certainly have done that with many, many athletes. We're going to take a little pivot today. Instead of talking about X's and O's, because there's lots of places right now. Go to altus. I don't know if it's altus.com or altus.edu. Just Google it. You'll find many, many things. I know Stuart McMillan, the CEO of Altus, does an amazing weekly newsletter that Dan is the head writer of for lots and lots of blog posts. It's a must. You must be subscribed to those. So go do that. Today, we're going to kind of learn what made Dan. How did he get to be today's coaching guru? I know he loves for me to call him that, but how did he get to where he is today? What people poured into him? What experiences did he have to get to where he is today in 2023? So Dan, to kick us off here, as a former athlete myself, that's hard to describe when you see so many great athletes out there today. But yes, I did do track a little bit. But at some point in my life, I realized that track and coaching wasn't just something that happened to me. Coach would bark out orders. I'd say, yes, sir, and go do it. At one time, and I can still remember it pretty distinctly, a light switch kind of flipped. And I realized, oh, wait a minute, I could be a coach. Like that's an actual profession. People do this and get paid. Where does coaching start for you?
Well, probably a product of my environment. I grew up in Southwestern Ohio, near the city called Dayton. Father ran a construction company, and we were farmers. And his people were in Wisconsin, and they were all dairy farmers. So I was back and forth. But I think growing up, the son of a construction foreman and a farmer really helped me become what I call a generalist. You got to wear a lot of hats in both of those entities. So grew up very rural in the 60s, and that was a period where you did whatever sport was in season. So I played football and basketball and baseball and track and field and ice hockey on the ponds and factory league ice hockey and you name it. Now, we lived in a really remote area. So, if we got together, there might be 4 or 5 guys tops. So we had to invent variations of the sport. So like 2-on-2 basketball, where a third guy rotated in, or 4-on-3 ice hockey on the golf course ponds. Or, we had decathlons, we built high jump standards, post in the ground, and pole vaulted into car pits and threw shot puts and what have you. And, 3-on-3 flag football kind of stuff before flag football was around. So I was always kind of an organizer and a leader and trying to figure out the essentials and the ABCs of the sport. So it probably started, when I was an adolescent, and probably got more intense, as I got into what we call middle school now, or high school.
How did that lead to, today we know you more specifically as a track coach, but us that know maybe one layer down, we know you've worked with many, many, many other sports. How did track become the sport? If it even did, how did it, morph into, like, you were a track coach who branched out, or how did that even come about?
Yeah, good question. Well, I played football back in the suspension helmet days. I had a lot of concussions, and it was pretty authoritarian, top-down military punishment. We did hours of punishment training and whatnot. Just it really bothered me that I was paying the price for somebody else's mistake. Basketball, I was a point guard. I could pass like crazy and dribble and play defense, so I couldn't shoot worth a darn. Baseball, I was okay in Little League, but then when I got to Class E ball, and then there was a curveball, and I couldn't hit the curveball, so that was out. We didn't have soccer back then. I was kind of a short mesomorph, power, good agility guy. So ice hockey was there, but it was cost prohibitive, and it's hard to find access to stuff. So track was kind of the default because it was simple, it was easy. You didn't have to have a lot of money to do it. And luckily, my high school track coach, we didn't have middle school sport because back then the bond levies failed and all of that. So my first experience with organized sport outside of Little League Baseball was in high school. And my track coach was a guidance counselor, and he was pretty, what I would call altruistic, kind of a Maslow guy. And, I was really intrigued by how he ran practices and treated people and whatnot. And so that kind of got me thinking that of all the sports out there, and I love sport, and I love all sports still today, it just felt better.
What do you remember his name?
Yeah, Ken Carpenter.
Ken Carpenter. So what did Ken do that was kind of different from some of the other sport coaches that you had?
Well, like I kind of fell in love with pole vaulting, and he came over and he says, I've worked with a few pole vaulters, but I really don't know it. But if you go into the library, here's a few books that talk about it that have nice photo sequences, and here's some coaching journals, because he knew I was a reader and I spent a lot of time in the library. So that started me on my journey of how people train and using what we call kinograms now. Back then, they had photo sequences like in Scholastic Coach and Athletic Journal. And then Fred Wilt's Track Technique, they had how you train sections, like how someone trains in the fall and the winter and the spring and then in season. So Ken started me on this research journey on how people train and what are the essentials of the event.
That's interesting. In today's world, someone can be called out pretty quickly if they say, I know everything about how to coach X, Y, and Z, right? I mean, there's so many resources. Back in this era, the only resource you had was the library. There weren't even VHS tapes of things like that. And there was probably, I would imagine there was little to no formal coaching education at that point as well. So Ken, in this little town of Southwest Ohio, easily could have said, hey, Dan, I know everything about how to coach vault. Just shut up, listen, and let's go. But instead, there was this humility of like, hey, man, yeah, I've worked with a couple, but if you want to get better, you might want to help yourself. Go to the library, check out these books, and start the journey that way. That's interesting, that humility.
Yeah, he was what we call now a nudge coach. So he'd come over during practice and say, "Look, you look pretty tired. Maybe move your run up a little bit. You're not quite getting there." Or, we'd warm up for practice, and he'd go, "Reminder: we got pretty big headwinds today, so you may want to grip down." So he knew a little bit about the event, but he didn't stand there every day and overcoach or whatnot, primarily because he was the only coach and he had to coach all the events. So that was probably another gift to see how he managed, how he rotated through the week, like early practice with the long jumpers and the hurdlers, then late practice time, the middle distance guys. So it got me thinking about how to organize practice when you got big numbers.
Well, I love that you kind of started as a pole vaulter. It reminds me of we had Harry Mara on the podcast way back, season 1, I think now, and he mentioned being at the boys club, Boy Scouts meeting, and they just tied a rope between 2 trees and got a stick, and he goes, and I just fell in love. So, there's something special about a vaulter specifically when they get started into track and field. How far did you take vaulting?
Well, I started out in the steel pole days, so the Swedish steel poles, they didn't bend. It was heavy as hell. I only gripped about halfway on it because it was probably a 15-foot pole. And we landed in sawdust that first year. And then we got smart and kind of raided a junkyard and tore out car seats from buses and trucks and stole a batting cage net from a rival school and kind of made our own pole vault pit. Back then, the standards didn't move. They were really post on the ground. So there wasn't a lot of strategy there other than lower your grip or raise your grip because you couldn't move the standards. It was an asphalt runway. The runway I had on our farm was grass runway. And then we had plywood at takeoff because the takeoff would get dug out. So we just kept moving plywood sheets in to keep from jumping out of a deep hole. So I jumped all the way through high school. I think my best was like 3 meters, 80, something like that, 12 something, and tried to vault in university. I actually went to Rose-Hulman to do track and field as an engineering institute.
I was going to say, what an engineering school. Is that right?
Yeah. And figured it out real quick. I didn't have the math background to do it. So migrated back to Dayton and then went to the state school there, Wright State University, and really had no idea what I was doing. I just, other than trying to avoid the Vietnam War with the student deferment.
That's so funny. I went to an engineering school my first year, and same thing, math. I was like, oh yeah, no, I can't do this at all. And then went to Troy University I studied public relations. I went real easy after the engineering fail for me.
Well, the school I grew up in, we had algebra 1 and 2 and geometry and trig. So I was okay there, but I'd never had calculus. And the first day of engineering math, the guy goes, this is a review of calculus 1 and 2. And I'm like, a review? Like, I've never even had this stuff.
Like, I need a preview, not a review. Yeah. Well, as you matriculate through Wright State, what is your mindset for a career? Are you going in to be a coach? Are you going to do something else? What are you thinking as an undergrad there?
Well, I was, obviously, Wright State didn't have a track team and there were no track clubs or whatever. So I was trying to vault as an independent, first year in university and, trying to find a meet. I was driving to Eastern Michigan for an indoor meet and south side of Chicago for an indoor meet. And then, in the spring, you couldn't find meets. In the summer, you could find some all-comers, and finally, I was just like, this not working real well. And the high school I was at, they were drastically understaffed. And so I spent a lot of time there just because I like sport. And my AD there, Bob Fink, was a huge mentor. He let me work all kinds of realms, from equipment to purchasing to turf care, you name it, while I was going through high school. And I spent a lot of time in his office. And, he said, well, why don't you volunteer with the football staff? And then he said, why don't you volunteer with the track staff? Or, why don't you volunteer with the wrestling group? So I started volunteering. Back then, they didn't have GAs or internships or whatever. It was just called volunteer. And so I started coaching there. And I think the second year we had an offensive line coach who didn't have a lot of experience. I played O-line, so I kind of became the de facto O-line coach, and just things kind of cycled from there.
What did you actually end up getting your undergrad in? If you had to make me bet, I would have said biomechanics, but I kind of don't feel maybe that was it.
Well, biomechanics really wasn't a thing back then. If it was, I would have been all over it.
Right.
I had an aptitude for science, probably because of growing up on the farm, and there's a lot of science in farming, and then construction, there's a lot of engineering and science. So I had math, science aptitude. So I just kept taking a lot of science courses. I ended up with minors in about every science, like physics, chemistry. To be honest, I was dodging the Vietnam War. So as long as I stayed above a 2.0 and I had a full schedule. Yeah. And so it was real biased by sciences. And then my last year, a counselor that had to sign off on my, course work. He goes, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "What do you mean? What am I doing?" He goes, "Well, you've been here almost 4 years and I don't see a degree here." And he goes, "Are you dodging the war?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he goes, "Okay. Um, there's a shortage of science teachers and male science teachers. And if you dive into this special program for science teachers, we can get you a certification, and that'll probably serve as a good excuse to stay out of the war." And I was like, "Okay, I'm all in." So that last year, I just really dove into all kinds of educational curriculum and courses, and ended up with a comprehensive science certificate so I could teach any science and math.
We're going to dive into this later on, but I'm noticing a theme of non-specialization, of generalization. And it would be very hard for someone to pigeonhole you as a sprints coach or a jumps coach. And we've actually had this topic. I think Boo and I talked about it. Certainly Brooks Johnson and I talked about it back in season 1 about being a track coach, not necessarily being a sprints coach or distance coach. But I'm kind of noticing that theme even through your formal education there at Wright State. You're like, yeah, I just took a lot of different sciences and maths, and eventually it pigeonholed me. I shouldn't say pigeonholed, drove me into a science degree so that you could teach. That's interesting.
Yeah, and then 2 of my favorite classes, one was in journalism and the other was in applied psychology. And so I kind of went off on those routes too.
Huh, that's interesting. It's funny how that played into your career. Obviously, psychology plays into it as a coach, and now today you're doing a lot of journalistic stuff with blogs and what have you. That's interesting.
Well, I tell coaches all the time, build a big toolbox and build layers, because you never know when you're going to be called upon to use a tool.
I like that. Yeah, I am a tool, so I just figure I'll get used somewhere. So, did you go into teaching high school science?
Yeah, so my first job was at a small school southwest of Dayton called Carlisle. Ironically, it was in the same league that I grew up in.
Huh.
So I knew a lot of the things. And so I was like offensive line coach and eventually offensive coordinator, track coach with no assistant, intramural director, de facto ATC. They didn't have trainers back then, but because I knew science, I ended up taping ankles and taking the Kramer trainers courses that they had in the summer. And then we started a weightlifting program because I coached throwers. They assumed, I knew weightlifting and whatnot. So I was the summer weightlifting guy and conditioning guy. So again, wearing a lot of hats.
So at this point, is your career, you're like, what are you going to do? And you'd be a high school teacher. That's what you're going to do. High school teacher and coach at this point.
Well, luckily the Vietnam War was coming to an end, so I was kind of open-minded there, but to be honest, I had a lot of fun, and we had some great staffs, and I grew tremendously as a coach, in those 3 years at Carlisle. And I never really, people always ask, like, when did you know you were a coach? And I'm like, it's probably in my 50s, because I always kept the door open. I was always looking for something that, would ignite the passion greater than the passion I had for coaching. But whether it's fate or luck, like nothing intervened.
I know you very much as a teacher today, a teacher of coaches. At this point, are you teaching and helping other coaches while you're at Carlisle at this point, or are you still kind of in absorb and learning mode as far as what does it look like to coach offensive linemen? What's it look like to coach throwers, weight room coach, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, some of it, it was kind of not really a top-down mentorship kind of environment.
Mm-hmm.
So, as a summer conditioning guy, they assigned another coach. He had no clue. And so I was kind of like showing him what I knew and what I thought and why the programming was X. And then I finally got the school board to approve an assistant in track and field. So, kind of getting that guy up to speed. But I was always a believer in team leadership. So I was constantly taking the seniors and developing them as leaders and knowing about the sport and the intricacies and the layer of the sport. So I think I was doing a lot of mentorship with what I call senior leadership on the teams, the juniors and seniors that, because like in track, I think I had like 40 athletes out and there's no way I could be everywhere at once. And So I'd put the senior leader of the sprint hurdle group in charge of the warm up, and the senior leader in the throws group in charge of the weight room. And so I was probably already kind of doing mentorship in a hybrid way, if you will.
And you're still pretty young at this point. Where did that thought process come from? Because a lot of us, I'll just use me as an example. When I was a young coach, I was like the guy, put it all on my shoulders, I'll do it all. So I would have tried to warm up and watch every workout of the sprints, hurdles, everything with the throwers, instead of delegating and creating leaders. I actually would have been a cap on leadership. I would have said it all comes through me or not at all. How at such a young age were you able to start learning delegation and leadership teaching, learning? You may not have officially called it that, but that's what you were doing. You were uplifting leaders at that point.
Well, again, it circles back to the environmental discussion. When you work in construction or you work on a farm, you delegate, and you delegate fast, and you develop a network of experts. So if we were having trouble with the crop, I would, talk to 3 or 4 surrounding farmers and like, what are you guys doing? Do you have this problem or whatnot? So building a network of expertise just came naturally. It was the same thing in construction. Like we had a lot of Polish bricklayers in my dad's company. So if there was a masonry problem, I went to the lead bricklayer and I was like, I don't know what's going on here. What do you think? Or so on and so forth. So I think that kind of came intuitively just through environmental development.
That's fascinating. Not to jump ahead here, but using your perspective, today, I would say any athlete would be lucky to have you to coach them. As you look back to how you coached those throwers and sprinters, what kind of grade would you give yourself? Were you a good coach back then, or do you kind of cringe like, I can't believe I used to do this to those kids?
Well, like most things, I think it existed on a spectrum. So I think I did a good job of identifying the essentials, the KPIs, and holding people accountable, establishing a technical model and some allowances for that model, depending on development, health, or time of year, or whatnot. Interpersonal, I was terrible. I was still a little bit of top-down military. Way overused cynicism. Probably, interpersonal skills. Although most athletes thought I was a player's coach, I was probably a little too biased to accountability, and had absolutely no debrief plan at all. It was just kind of like, get on with it.
That's how my boss feels about me, Dan. He's just like, just get on with it, Mike.
Yeah.
So where do we go from Carlisle? What was the next step here?
Well, like I said, this is before the information age. Like if we wanted video, we had a Super 8 movie camera with a cartridge, and you'd video it, and then you'd take it to a drop off, and you'd wait 3 or 4 days for it to be processed. And then you had a hand crank viewer with a fan blowing on it, so the film wouldn't melt while you stopped and measured things.
Wait, hold on. There's a lesson there for people today who want to complain about the iPads and how hard it is to work. You had, first of all, the very fact that you had to send it away and it would come back in 3 to 4 days. If something takes 3 to 4 minutes to process now, we get all up in arms.
Well, chances are the problem you were working on 3 or 4 days ago had either been fixed or eliminated, or
Right.
a bigger arisen. And my master's thesis, I did an angle analysis in NCAA pole vault finals. And so I would project stuff on the wall, put onion skin paper, trace the figure, the shadow, take the paper down and measure the angles with a protractor, every jump, every step, for 18 finalists. That was quite a load.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say that had to take some time.
Yeah. So getting back to your question, one of the big aids for me was back then they had what we called coaching clinics. So Scholastic Coach would sponsor a few. Sometimes some of the indoor meets sponsored a coaching clinic, like we had the Cleveland meet and the Louisville meet and whatnot. And so I would travel, if I had access, and, I'd sleep in my car or whatever, I'd go to these coaching clinics. And one of the first ones I stumbled into Tom Tellez. He was a field event coach at UCLA then. And he got up and I think he was talking on jump dynamics or something. And I was just blown away. Like, here's a guy talking about biomechanics and kinesiology and the scientific process and whatnot. I was like, that's me. So I started stalking the guy. Like, if he spoke, I was there. And after he spoke, I followed him around and asked questions. And I'd get up for breakfast, like at 5 a.m. and sit in the breakfast bar, hoping he came down for breakfast. And then I'd kind of bump into him. And so I was a stalker. And so I'd had quite a bit of success as a high school coach. And I thought, I might want to try this university level stuff. But so I sent out thousands of letters. And back then they were just starting this graduate assistantship concept or paradigm. And I wrote to all of them. Joe Piani at Notre Dame, if the guy had profile, I wrote, and I got 0 responses. I was like, well, the mail end of things isn't working real well. So my last year in high school, Coach Tellez was hired away from UCLA to start the program at Houston. And I ran into him and I said, Coach, I'm looking to do a graduate degree. And I know Houston has they're starting a sports science graduate degree, and that's kind of my realm. And, I was wondering if I came to Houston to study, could I help out with the team? And he was like, well, we don't have any money. And we're short staffed and it's a startup. And he goes, we can always use help, but like, how are you going to survive? And I said, well, I teach driver's ed. I can substitute teach. My wife works as a bookkeeper. We'll find a way. And he's like, well, whatever. And I think he just kind of blew me off. So I went home, told my wife we're moving to Houston. So we packed up a U-Haul, drove to Houston, didn't know a soul, rented a house, and kind of did some homework, figured out where Coach T lived, and we rented an apartment really close to where he lived. So I could stalk him on his run because I knew he ran every day. And I just showed up and he was like, what are you doing? I was like, I'm here. And I got into grad school. And luckily, in the department HPE and dance, they had student teachers and they were short supervisors. And I was the only grad student that ever taught school. So I got drafted into being a supervisor for student teachers. So I'm driving all over Houston, observing teachers and writing critiques. And my little Chevy didn't have air conditioning. So you can imagine driving around Houston, shirt, tie, and a jacket. I was going through 4 or 5 shirts a day. So the grad program was at night, which is perfect. It was night school. It's designed for coaches to come back. And so during the day, in the morning, I'd do the student teaching stuff. In the afternoon, I'd coach, I'd help out, measure steps, rake pits, shag shots, clean up the weight room, whatever it took. And then in the evening, I did grad school.
I can't imagine the worst part of that whole story was the driving around in a suit and tie in Houston. That probably had to solidify a little bit of like, yeah, I'm not an office guy. Like, I'm not a suit and tie guy. I'm a coach guy.
Well, teaching driver's ed to inner city kids with the Houston freeway system was probably the most heart-rending task I had.
So spend some time here with your time with Coach Tellez. I never got to know Coach Tellez very well, just know of the godlike status in regards to coaching. I remember, I think it was Boo who told me once that Coach Tellez had just an amazing eye. Like, he didn't need to video anything. It's probably, maybe there was some hyperbole there, but I don't know for Boo to be very hyperbolic though. But that Coach Tellez could watch a long jumper and like in his own mind, he could slow-mo that down so he could see the positions and stuff like that. How was that learning from someone and observing someone with those type of skills?
It was like drinking from a fire hose. So Coach T did a lot of film work. And this before VHS days, so it was still the same thing. You had to send it off, get it developed. But because it was at Houston and they had football film and whatnot, they had a faster process. So usually we could get the film the next day. And it was still the same thing, hand crank projector with a fan blowing on it and looking at things. So that's where I really got a big foundation on a technical model, and then allowance bandwidths for the various technical model components. So, it started there, and then, Coach was a tough teacher. Someone would throw it, goes, "What'd you see?" And I'd say something. He goes, "Yeah, but that problem was caused by something way earlier. What did you see earlier?" And I was like, "Nothing." And so it kind of started out where I could watch the pathway and the movement of one foot, and then I could watch 2 feet at once, and then maybe the foot and the lower leg. So I just kind of worked up the food chain, kind of looking at postures and body segments and whatnot. And so it was a process. And, 50 years on, I'm still nowhere close to what Coach can see.
Is that something that can be learned? And we're getting just a tad close to X's and O's, but I am curious, when I coached, I could see generalities. And of course, I only coached 10 years. So I was a baby and still a baby in the coaching world. But I needed that film and to be able to slow-mo and see, where the foot placements are. Is that what you're talking about there? Is that a gift you think that can be learned with repetition? Or is that a God-given ability that's just like, man, you either have it or you don't?
Well, I think it exists on a spectrum. Some people see motion and shapes and whatnot, the artist perspective of things. And then some people are math people. And so they're probably seeing angles more so and whatnot. But yeah, we teach, coaches' eye stuff all the time, like for postures, first and foremost, shapes of the body at various phases of movement, body segments, angles of the joints, and so on and so forth. So I think you can develop a checklist and over time, improve your coach's eye. And I think it's always important to follow that up with video analysis to kind of serve as a check and balance on your eye.
Working with Coach Delez, I'll go ahead and say it, assume that it had to be pretty special. What were some of the lessons learned? Again, not X's and O's, not what to do with a sprinter or jumper, but the how to coach lessons that you gained by working with Coach T.
Well, probably first and foremost was accountability. Like, you didn't slide. Like, if you did something, he told you what you did and what he thought needed to go better or whatnot, or what have you. So strong accountability. Programming, very simple, very basic, not a lot of menu items. Like I knew anywhere in the world at any time of the year what people were doing because the program was the program. Now, he had some bandwidth allowances and whatnot in that, but he was what I would call a minimalist. And really identified the essentials, like what needed to be trained. He wasn't a big drilled guy. He had some teaching progressions, like with combined event athletes learning a new event. But, I really wouldn't call them drills. It was more teaching progressions. So he was kind of a do it in real time, error detect, error correct kind of coach. Excellent on feedback and sifting through need to know versus nice to know really, really well.
And are you still working with, call it the complete spectrum of track and field, or are you zeroed in on sprinters or jumpers, throwers?
With Coach T? Yeah, he had a small staff, so he was coaching everything. He had some assistants or whatnot, but he had his hands all over the place. So yeah, I was there, and Howie Ryan was a distance coach, and I'd help him on key workouts, and when guys were all spread out through a park or whatnot. So yeah, I was coaching, or I wasn't coaching. I was there helping in every event. I wouldn't say I ever coached at the U of H.
What time frame is this? And the only time frame I can kind of think of is Carl and Leroy and Floyd.
Yeah, so I was there Carl's first 2 years. So I saw him come in as a freshman. He'd had some knee issues, and back then we didn't have arthroscope surgery. So Coach T switched his jumping leg. A lot of people don't realize in high school, when he went to the Pan Am Games and medaled, that was on his left leg, and the rest of his career was on his right leg. So I saw that transformation, and we had a lot of decathletes and heptathletes. So, again, a big general, universal, see how things fit kind of puzzle. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention another mentor, Victor Lopez. He was a grad student at Houston at the time and eventually became longtime coach at Rice. And Victor came from Puerto Rico. His coaches were influenced by Calvasi and Vittoria in Italy and some Cuban influences. And so from Victor, I kind of learned the art side of coaching, where Coach T, I was drinking from the fire hose on the science. So I really had a beautiful setup there. All day long in the office from Victor, it was the art of coaching, rhythm, and, seeing the big picture and the patterns and whatnot. And then all afternoon with Coach T, it was the science. So I was really blessed to grow up with two incredible mentors at that stage in my career.
What was it like? You're coming from, Carlisle in Southwest Ohio, small school, middle of nowhere type of area, to, first of all, big city. You mentioned the Houston highway systems, which if you were saying they were messed up back then, I don't know how you would describe them today, because it's 10x on what they have going on in Houston now. But you're talking about a time when you talked about Carl and some of the other guys. And so, you're getting athletes out of high school there that are, I would have to assume you did not even think could be imaginable in Carlisle. How was there any kind of intimidation factor? Was there any kind of, just like the story you told about Coach Tellez switching Carl's leg? Like, that to me is a big thing. This, Carl was the man out of high school as well. Let's not forget that. And, obviously became legend of Houston and then legend for Team USA. What was your mindset of like these athletes? You've got some amazing athletes around you. Did you even realize that at that point, Coach Tellez and Coach Lopez and Carl and the gang? Did you kind of realize, did you even have any kind of sense of like, I'm kind of in a mecca right now, soaking it all up?
Yeah, it was kind of like going to Disneyland every day, to be honest. Intimidation, no, because Coach Tellez, he taught in parables a lot of times. And, one day he was watching me, I was helping catch steps or something, and I said something to an athlete, and he pulled me aside. He goes, Dan, sometimes it's so much what you don't say as to what you say, and that, like, whoa. So he was being kind. I was over coaching and probably over reporting. And so it really was an intimidation factor, because like I said, I wasn't like really directly coaching. It was kind of, I knew my space, and he established the boundaries and guardrails, and, I respected those.
So how long were you there with Coach Tellez, and what was next?
Yeah, I was there for 3 years, and then he said it was time to leave the nest. So I went to Wichita State and worked with Herm Wilson for a year. Financials were a little bit shaky then. Back then they had the U staff meet, where the college guys and the pro guys kind of got together, because back then it was the AAU and the NCAA battles. And this meet was kind of the only meet in America where they commingled. Well, that was the year that Congress passed a bunch of the antitrust stuff and whatnot. So that meet died on the vine, and I was left holding the bag. I had no money. So I basically worked in Wichita for a year for hardly anything. And I think Coach Tellez felt kind of bad, that he helped me get that job and it blew up. So he helped me get a job at UTEP. And so after Wichita State, I went to UTEP and for the 83-84 season. And that was a real education and baptism under fire.
Any thoughts at this point? You go to UH, and I don't want to say you did it on a whim, but there was, it's not like you had a formal invitation. Like you said, you showed up and Coach T was like, oh, hi. Thank God he allowed you to still be involved and everything. Then you go to Wichita and this blows up. Now you're going down to El Paso. Any part at this time, you're married with your career, about like, is this the right thing for me? Should I be trying to do something else that has a little bit more stability?
Well, to be honest, I was so driven by the journey. Luckily I had a wife that kind of open-minded. I don't think she was happy. We moved 18 times in 47 years of marriage. So, finally she just planted her feet in Austin, said, you go work wherever you got to work. But, you know, at the time we were young and it was exciting. And, you know, El Paso was like going to Mars. You know, we grew up in the Midwest with all that. And then Houston, then you go out to the desert mountains and a total different culture. It was like, so it was exciting.
You mentioned being so focused on the journey. At that point of your age and stage and life and career, was there an end game in sight? Was it like, I am working towards to become a head college coach or to become an Olympic coach? Or was it just the journey was to coach?
It was just a coach. Like, to be honest, like at UTEP, I was named head women's coach. I wasn't prepared, wasn't qualified, but that was the role. And then men's field event coach. So again, baptism under fire. You know, I'm coaching, you know, world top 10 ranked people, you know, 84 Olympics. I think I had 7 athletes in the Olympic Games. I had 2 gals won medals. And so at age 30, I thought, you know, I'm friggin' genius. I got this thing figured out. But, you know, then reality hit real quick.
Hey, we've all had that at 30. I think 30 is that year where you just go like, I'm a genius. And then 40, you're like, what in the world was I thinking?
But I've never had the desire to be a head coach or a director or whatnot. You know, I've had those roles placed upon me, but I'm more a behind the curtain guy. Like team photos, I try to not be in or stand in the background or whatnot. I've never been a me out in front kind of guy. I don't know why, but that's just me.
Yeah, my experience with you, I would agree with that. You know, I we'll get to a story that you really impacted my life when you were at Florida back in 2005. But kind of the same thing. You're just kind of this is no meant for any disrespect, but you're kind of a in the shadows in the corner guy. But at the end of the day, you know who's this is gonna be a little bit of overstatement, but you know who's pulling the strings. What I mean by that, who's coaching. You never that's never in doubt. It's just, you're not the guy. I've never seen you be the guy that's in front, rah, 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 yelling at athletes. I just have never seen that nor heard that at all.
Not my style.
I'm quite amazed. We're in around 84 at UTEP, and the people that have been around you are quite stunning. You could stop right there and you have a Mount Rushmore of people, from Victor Lopez, Tom Tellez, Herm Wilson. Come on. Many people probably today don't remember Herm Wilson, but first of all, the guy was amazing person, but also an awesome coach. I'm just kind of floored by this people that you either surrounded yourself with or found yourself surrounded by at that point in this coaching profession.
Yeah. So I give Herm credit. Like recruiting to Wichita, Kansas wasn't easy. And he basically recruited Kansas, Colorado, Kansas City area. And so hours and hours in the car and home visits and looking for sleepers and whatnot. So I really learned the recruiting game from Herm, and Herm was friggin' genius at finding sleepers and developing people. You know, he'd have top 20 cross country teams, and all the guys were from about an hour away, you know, just really good at developing local talent. And so he taught me the recruiting side of things for sure. And then at UTEP, it was more, Larry Heidebrecht was the head coach, but it was more of the athletes. You know, we had people like Burt Cameron and Milt Oddie, and my 2 medalists, Kim Turner, Charmaine Crooks, and Cynthia Henry in the long jump. And, you know, I started coaching the hammer. I'd never even seen the hammer. A guy walks in my office, Tori Janssen. He's like 6'8", 280 pounds, from Norway. Hi, I'm Tori. I throw hammer. Do you know hammer? And I was like, no, I don't, but I'm here to learn. And then a year later, he broke world record in the indoor weight throw. And, you know, it's just the athletes there. And that started me on my international networking then, because in the summers, I'd go to Europe by Eurail Pass and travel over Europe and go to these guys and gals clubs and see how they're coached and meet their personal coach and their federation people trying to get background, and, you know, going to meets and, you know, following the Russians, East Germans around, see how they warmed up for meets and what they did and all of that. And then I stumbled onto another mentor in that process, Bjorn Blomberg. He was a Swedish coach and following at their sport high school, and he was a big throws guy, and he became super influential. And Bjorn was Estonian by birth, so he had studied in Kiev at the Kiev Sport Institute and Leipzig in the East German, so he had access to all the Eastern Bloc literature and shared generously. So that's where I really expanded my understanding of programming and the essentials and, integrated sports science, in a high performance setting.
Now, Dan, one of the things, we have two main goals here. One is to uplift and honor your journey, which, we're not even halfway in, and it's astounding. I'm like a kid in a candy store here. The other goal is to bring value to those who choose to listen to us. We're just so humbled that anybody would press play. These are not easy podcasts to listen to because they're hour and a half, 2 hours. We're going to be all of 2+ hours today. So I want to sprinkle in a little value here because you just mentioned something that I think might be fairly common. I was going to pigeonhole this to college coaches, but maybe high school coaches too. You said, I'd never coached hammer, and in walks this 6'8". That may be the first place to start. Get someone who's 6'8", hammer thrower. How did you, again, not talking about the X's and O's, what actual drills and such that you did with this guy, but how did you start to learn the hammer? Then you're kind of thrown into it. You got a hammer thrower. I'm thinking about Florida just added the javelin not too long ago for high school. So here are a bunch of high school coaches probably really good at coaching the shot and discus, and now they're forced for some of them. Others are super happy that they're going to have to start coaching the javelin. How do you, as a coach who you're good, you know how to coach, but here's a brand new event, how do you embrace that and do right for the athlete as the coach?
Well, the first thing is there's a lot of commonalities in various events. So throwing's throwing. I mean, the hammer throw, the guy turns around the circle a few times and then releases the hammer, and there's vertical, horizontal factors, translational factors. So what are the essentials for throwing? Teach what you know. So from the shot and the disc, you know certain postures at certain phases of the throws, and then you start looking, okay, what are the postures? And I've always been a common denominator rather than model whoever's hot is like, who are the 10 best and what are the common things they're doing at the various phases of the throw. So my first stop was to get just shitloads of photo sequences of the top hammer throwers. Orra McMurray had all these Super 8 films that you could buy from Track and Field News, and I got everything he had on the hammer throw, and I'd put that up, and Tori would come in and we would talk about it. We'd have film of Tori, so we'd put up compare and contrast and say, okay, double support, here you are, and here's where Sadiq is, and here's single support, and here's your posture. And, we'd look at orbitals, like there's some essentials to the throw. So we know like the orbitals, highs and lows, should kind of stay on a line. And if the orbitals are offset, then you're probably going to split vectors and not throw as far. So it's kind of respecting the essentials and the common denominators, using a lot of compare contrast from, best model, best practice to where you're at. And then, coaches we hierarchically rank viruses we see in athletes. So dysfunctional movements are things that bother us or whatnot. So developing a nice hierarchy list of problems. So Tori was 6'8", really long-waisted. So he lost his upper body positioning a lot. So that was a theme. It's like, we got to stabilize this upper body. If you're leaning this way and this way or back or whatnot, those are big rocks. Like, let's get the big rocks done really well. And then luckily he knew the event really well. And we had a bunch of post-collegiate guys like Peter Farmer and Terry Gent that were around still throwing, and, radical ideas. Peter was from Australia and trained a lot in Europe, and Gent was from Ireland and he had the Irish look. And so there was kind of a commingling of philosophies and whatnot. And just step back and deductive reasoning. And it was like, okay, he believes this guy believes this guy believes this, probably somewhere in the middle.
I'm picturing that where you had those kinograms of, the top 10, and you have, what was it, Tori? Is that his name?
Yeah.
And you have Tori, and you're like, all right, see where you are. Well, okay, maybe we need to do this. It sounds like you really leaned into collaboration with the athlete.
Yeah. I've always been a collaborator. Like I said, when I was a young coach, I wasn't very good on debriefing, and it really wasn't a term until probably 10 years ago.
Right.
But I always interviewed athletes like before practice. How you feeling? Where are you sore? Anything stiff? How's life 101? And then informal debriefs during the workout, like how hard was that, on a 1 to 10 scale, or, at the end of the workout, what did you like? What didn't you like? What didn't you understand? So I've always kind of been a collaborator, because I think as a young coach or as a young athlete, I was never asked what's going on in my world.
Right.
And, a lot of my coaching principles probably came from bad coaching as a high schooler, top down authoritarian punishment, no dialogue, just do it. You're injured, rub dirt on it, keep going. Those kinds of things that always stuck in me. And I always swore that, I would never coach the way I was coached by a lot of the various coaches I had. And then also, I think I sought all kinds of advice, and a lot of times people just wouldn't respond. Coach Tellez was one of the few that would answer questions after he gave a speech at a clinic or whatnot. And that was another box. I was like, hey, if I'm ever positioned to help a young coach or an athlete, I'm going to do it, because I know what it's like to be a young athlete asking for help and not getting it, or a young coach asking for help and not getting it. So I think those scars, if you will, really drove my operational mindset, and still to this day.
Speaking of that, where are you in regards to you teaching others at this point? Are you speaking at clinics at all? I don't know if there were, if Track Technique was around there. Are you writing any articles? What are you doing coaching ed wise?
Well, I consult a lot with the Altus group, and we have all kinds of courses and exploration courses, and we have mentorships, live mentorships. I have mentorships through various organizations around the world. I advise probably 50, 60 coaches weekly.
I'm sorry, what were you doing at this point? You're at UTEP. What are you doing?
At UTEP, no, I was in my own world.
Yeah.
Luckily, they started coaching ed then. So I think one of the first projects is you went to the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, and they had these learn by do courses. So they had guys like Joe Vigil, Coach Tellez, and Ken Shannon, and John Arunian, the hurdle guy from Northern California. And you spent a week at the training center, sleeping in pretty bad conditions, eating pretty bad food, and you had to go out and learn these events, kind of the ABCs. And so that was another trip. I got in the station wagon, drove 2 days to Colorado, spent a week doing that. And so coaching ed was just starting. And then at UTEP, they started I think, level 1. And back then it was TAC. And so I was kind of on the ground floor with that, with Vern Gambetta and Gary Winkler. And Coach Vigil was kind of the godfather. Coach Tellez and Coach Vigil were kind of the godfathers on that. So I was kind of on the ground there. And then simultaneously, Victor started the NACAC group in the Caribbean.
Right.
So I started, presenting courses and talking about events and whatnot with Victor. All of us did. Lauren Seagrave, Vern Gambetta, Gary Wilson, Jerry, all of us were, in the Caribbean. And level 1 down there, I think, was a week. Level 2 was 2 weeks. And so we'd take time away and help Victor out with that for like no money at all. I'd come back to my wife and go, you lost money. Like, why are you doing this? And so in my UTEP days, I started with the TAC group and then the NACAC group. I don't think NACAC was the name then, but that was the foundation.
Yeah, I remember that I only knew of that because of Victor. I still remember those little ads he would have in Track and Field News and Track Technique. I remember those. Absolutely. So how long at UTEP, and and why next?
Well, 2 years, and then we had a huge scandal. So the athletes were being paid. We had world number one guys, and they were getting money under the table and whatnot, and it blew up. And everybody left town except for me. I was kind of left holding the bag, and ultimately, I was cleared of any wrongdoing, and the AD saying. So I'd bumped into Lauren Seagrave, and he was like, "Hey, we're trying to, really build the women's program at LSU, and we need a men's field event coach, and you'd be the guy." And so we moved to Baton Rouge.
Wow, that's a pretty good place, and with a pretty good guy, Lawrence Seagrave, to learn from. You'd already had experience with him.
Yeah, and Billy Maxwell was the men's coach.
Yeah.
And we had a crazy staff. Andy McGinnis was a Canadian sprint hurdle coach.
Yeah.
And, Sam Seams was kind of the ops director before that term was even out. And it was 11 years of incredible experiences. When we got there, I don't think women had ever even had a gal make it to nationals. And in 11 years, we won 19 national titles indoors and out with the men and women, like I think 11 in a row with the women. And, it was ground up. It was the Wild West days. Probably half the rules in the rule book came from, gray areas we explored while we were at UTEP. But it was tremendous learning experience and journey, and great people in Louisiana, and culture and food, and still my wife's favorite place to live. Our kids were raised there, during their adolescent years. And so a lot of fun memories of Baton Rouge and Louisiana.
I love connecting all the pieces because, as you were mentioning, Billy Maxwell and all that gang, I was like, wait a minute, we had Sam Seams on the podcast back in October, and I remember Sam talking about that's where he kind of got his coaching from, Western Kentucky, another steel pole vaulter, by the way, back in the day.
Yep.
in Kentucky. So I love that connection there. It's hard to imagine. You mentioned that LSU really hadn't won anything up to that point. That's hard. My history only goes so far back, and all of my history with LSU is they always win. There's always national titles. There's always All-Americans, national champions there. You guys were kind of on that ground floor of actually building that up with Lauren and Billy. I mean, just amazing crew there.
Yeah, I think the men had won a national title in 1933, and SEC they weren't on the radar at all. And the women, I mean, it was ground zero. I mean, first couple of years we took big risk and probably missed more than we hit, but it was pretty hard to attract people to a school that had no history or culture or reputation. And we had to bang the trees. My international connections and Andy's connections in Canada, we had to kind of lean on the foreign arm quite a bit initially. And then Billy had a lot of East Coast connections, so we recruited the crap out of the East Coast. And the talent pool in Louisiana was pretty sparse, to be honest. The level of coaching wasn't that great, but we went out and banged the trees and found sleepers and whatnot. And, I'd probably say a third of the athletes who were All-Americans for me were walk-on kids from Louisiana.
What do you, as you're going through that, and I love that you ended that story with that sentence there, that, a third were walk-ons from Louisiana. Do you get more satisfaction out of that? I'm not even going to throw numbers because that would pigeonhole you into an event. A walk-on type of kid that goes on to become an All-American, or that All-American high schooler that comes in and goes on to a great pro career. Where's more satisfaction for you?
I'm not a favorites guy, so I'm a buy-in or curtain guy and not a favorites guy. So I get asked all the time, what's your favorite food or country or whatnot? So, it's spectral. It's like, where am I at? What's going on? They're both tremendously rewarding. If I had to bias because of how I grew up, I'm probably the underdog guy, the walk-on guy.
Yeah.
I'm probably a little more driven, with that walk-on athlete and, a prima donna entitled parachute helicopter athlete.
Right. I would have been a great disappointment for you. I would have been that underdog, but I unfortunately would have stayed the underdog. I would have challenged all your coaching on how good it could actually change a human.
Well, I mean, sometimes, a shift of 1 inch is way more powerful than a shift of a mile.
Hmm. That is so over my head. That was such a smart thing. I can't even concept that. Remember, I went to high school and college in Alabama, Dan. So, you got to tone it down a little bit for me to understand.
All right.
Where are you at this time with LSU? You're growing that program with the crew that is with you there. And again, just another, who's who Mount Rushmore people, great coaches and great people, and really, for my generation, groundbreaking coaches, and you're right there with them. You're doing things that, we never would have thought of that were even possible. Where are you with your other sports? Today I know you as a guy that can go work with baseball players, NFL people, of course, track. Are you strictly just track, or is there any branching out with any other sports, athletic training, those other things that you are highly skilled at today?
Yeah, I'd kind of developed by then kind of a reputation on return to play work, coming back from injuries or rehab or whatnot. So I was dabbling on that, and a lot of the sport coaches like Jeff McDonald, the tennis coach there, if they had a injury factor, or the gymnastics coach or whatnot, I'd make suggestions, or try to work around the training room and not step on toes or what have you. And then Jerry Sullivan was the receivers coach, and he'd have guys that were maybe a step slow getting ready for the combine or whatnot. And, I'd work with his receiver guys. So that's how I kind of got into the NFL world and had success with a few guys through Jerry. And, Jerry, all through his career, I would always send guys a step slow, or a guy coming off of surgery or whatnot. So that was the beginning of a long-term relationship there. But, some basketball guys would come in, coming off a knee injury, or a gymnast off a knee surgery or ankle surgery and whatnot. So it was probably the beginning of that kind of branching out into the return to play world and consultancy world.
A guy like me, I see those as two fairly different things, meaning the return to play and the coaching track and field. Did you see them as two different avenues, or was it all kind of the same? I'm learning very much about you, Dan, here. Spectrum. Absolutes are not absolutes. Or did you see those as two different branches, or was that a spectrum of the same type of human performance, if you will?
Well, whether it's track and field or a different sporting event, I kind of use the pyramid analogy. You got physical literacy as the base. So, identify the components of physical literacy. And then the next level is global sport literacy. So like running, change in direction, and what have you. And then there's specific sport literacy. So whether you're with a healthy athlete or an injured athlete, you still have to respect where they're at on the pyramid. So for me, it's pretty similar operating paradigms.
And it's regardless of the sport, because, and I'm going to maybe answer this, because track is the basis of all sports. Receiver is running track, right? A lineman is doing a lot of track movements. Is that why you can go from sport to sport to sport? It's really athlete, not sport driven.
Well, I think in track and field, you kind of have to wear a biomechanics hat and a physiology hat and a programming hat and a plan B hat. Let's be honest, track and field coaches are genius at plan B, because plan A seldom happens. So I think you're kind of used to wearing all these hats, and you know when to put one on and take one off.
I like that. Okay, keep us moving forward. LSU for how many years?
11 years.
11 years. And to this day, it was your wife's favorite place. So this had to be kind of hard to leave and go to the next step.
So public schools were a challenge in Baton Rouge back then. And we had two kids entering primary school, and they were both in private schools, which at the time was about $10K each. And my wife had a job, I had a job, and unfortunately LSU kept firing football coaches, so the track coaches never got raises. There wasn't a bonus system. We were winning all these nationals, and it was kind of a handshake and here's a certificate. So financially, we were struggling. We still hadn't been able to buy a home. We're still renting and whatnot. And Bubba Thornton called me. He just got appointed the head coach at Texas, and he said, I'm looking for field event, combined event guy, and a guy that can do a lot of the duties I don't like to do, like travel and equipment and management. And I was like, yeah, I'm your guy. And so it was a monster pay raise, and we could put our kids in a public school. We moved around Rock with really good schools. So it was not only a pay increase, but a huge income increase because of the private schooling cost. And so 8 years at the University of Texas, tremendous education on politics and bureaucracy, but worked for a tremendous AD, DeLoss Dodds, who was track coach, longtime track coach at Kansas State. The only AD I ever had come into my office after a meet and talk shop.
Is that right? Which I would expect that from DeLoss. I know, big track background there. No other AD even like, hey, so how'd it go? Or, hey, I saw you guys broke this record. Nothing.
Nope.
Oh man, that just makes me sad for ADs. That's not good. At Texas, and Bubba Thornton, amazing coach, a guy that kind of gets lost because he hasn't coached in a while now. So not like in our young, acute memories, we forget what Bubba did at the schools that he was at and at Texas, and the many All-Americans and sprinters and just full teams he had there. Are you at this point? I mean, it's quite disappointing, but probably understandable maybe, that you mentioned being there at LSU for so long, and your statement was we still weren't even able to buy a house. Like, that's just so disappointing, right? That our track coaches, like, I mean, just bare minimum care can afford a house. You go to Texas, which changes some things there for you. How was the experience of now? Are you Dan Pfaff, someone like in today's world, you're Dan Pfaff, someone people seek out? It feels like somewhere maybe at the LSU level, it switches, because before that, I'm getting the feeling of like, you're certainly leading, but you are still seeking out other people and getting educated and being educated and going to Europe and learning different systems. Did that flip at LSU, or did that flip at Texas? Or how do you think about that?
Well, I think it probably started the tail end of LSU and then really blew up at Texas. So I started coaching some post-collegiates at LSU, and they had success on the world stage. And then more and more people came. So like a Donovan Bailey shows up, and people like that. And so because of that profile, more and more people would visit, European coaches, European athletes, people from Australia, whatever. So probably the success of the post-collegiate athletes on the world stage probably drove the mentorship, or people coming by to, talk shop, or, dialogue, or, increase each other's network, or what have you. So I would say the post-collegiate expansion probably drove that more than what I was doing on the college level. That said, with Victor's work in the NACAC region, a lot of Caribbean coaches or athletes would stop in for various lengths of visits. So I would say the exposure in the NACAC region, and then the success of our post-collegiates on the world stage, probably drove the expansion of the network, if you will.
And you've had success at kind of the three levels: high school, and that's a little bit downplaying when I say success here. A lot of success and high level success at all kind of three levels here: the high school, the collegiate, and post collegiate. So you've worked with 16-year-olds, 36-year-olds that are at high level mentally, as far as like wanting to be better, listening, yes sir, no sir, what do I got to do, those kind of things. Is there a level, are any of those levels easier than the other? And what I mean by that is I think of, and I've coached high school and college, definitely don't have anywhere near experience on the post-collegiate side. But on the high school level, I could answer that and say, yes, it's easier in high school because they're kids. They want to have fun. That's more fun. That's easier. I could also say for college, well, that was easier because I had higher quality athletes when I was at Mississippi State. So we got to do more things, and, maybe it's more fun to win an SEC title than it is to win a Corn Belt high school conference title. That's an actual conference around here. But also maybe you could tell me on the post-collegiate, like, yeah, what's easier and more fun, man, winning a gold medal, Mike, that's more fun and easier. Is there a level for you that is more enjoyable, more satisfaction?
No, I kind of crave diversity. So, currently, I coach age group kids in my neighborhood, with tennis, basketball, or baseball, or I've got 80-year-old masters athletes I work with. I'm currently directly coaching 3 Paralympic sprinters around the world. So, each stage or event or sport is a unique puzzle, and I like puzzles, and I enjoy the puzzles. And I really need diversity. Like, I kind of saw a trend or pattern myself, like, in the university setting, as the season goes down, your squad numbers go down. And so you might start out the fall with 40 kids in your field event group. And then by the time you get to nationals, there's probably 5 or 6 left standing.
Right.
And I just saw a trend that I overcoached the shit out of these kids when the group got too small. So I'm one of those guys that kind of needs a bigger group and diverse groups. And, I've had stops where I'm the throws guy or the jumps guy or the sprints guy. And again, those are slippery slopes for me. So I just figured out real early on that I need diversity and I need numbers. That's me.
You mentioned you're working with younger athletes in the 8, 9, 10 years old. Do they have any idea who you are?
No.
Do their parents?
Yeah, most of the parents in this day and age, they Google you or,
Yeah.
whatever. And, but most of the kids, I'm just Mr. Dan. And it's like, hey, I'm having trouble with free throws. Can you watch me? And, yeah, poor. Hey, I rolled my ankle. What should I do?
Mr. Dan. I love that.
Well, it's still the deep South, right?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I wonder if there's like a parent who doesn't do their due diligence and Google you, and they're like, that Dan guy, I just don't know that he knows what he's talking about. And it's like, man, just hit the Google button, buddy.
Well, I say this in a lot of presentations. As a coach, you got to reprove yourself every day. And I don't care what your CV is, especially in this day and age, you got to reprove yourself every day on a lot of levels.
Yeah, that's good. And that's a good, like, keeping your humility in check as well. It's like, if you keep thinking you don't ever have to prove yourself anymore, it's like, well, does that mean you still don't try to learn more? Does that mean you're not trying to experiment and do what's right for athletes? Athletes are different today than they were yesterday. This athlete's different from that athlete. How do you keep yourself hungry, if you will, to keep the knowledge level going?
Yeah, I just got off a call this morning with one of my direct athletes, and we were looking at film from behind and looking at movement pathways of the foot axis and all that. And, he just point blank, he goes, "Are you sure that that's just not how I am?" And I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that we can fix this or clean this up. And so, and I've been with this guy since 2009. And,
Wow.
I'm still having to revalidate my stance.
Love it. All right. Well, we got a lot of topics to keep going, so I want to keep pushing forward in the career, Dan. How long at Texas, and what was next?
So I kind of got burnt out on the politics and the grind of college coaching. Like, unfortunately, my family, my wife, and my kids paid a tremendous price for my career. And I was really looking for a way to kind of back off, like NCAA track. You started traveling beginning of January, and then I was in Europe all summer with these postgrads. So basically 9 months of the year, I wasn't around. And So I thought, well, I'm having success with these pro guys. Let me get a small pro group and where I can kind of control things a lot more and maybe bring in an assistant to do some of this stuff. And so I went into a private practice, which was probably not a great idea. But one of our first profile clients was Marianne Jones, and Nike had kind of hired me to oversee her and Tim Montgomery, and that ended up to be quite a shit show, and 5 years of lawsuits and $1 million in legal cost mistake. And while I was recovering from that, to safeguard assets, my lawyer suggested I move to Florida because Florida is a great place to protect your assets. And so luckily there was an opening at Florida, and Mike Holloway called me a mid-year opening. And so I moved to Florida in January. I think that was 05 maybe. And so I coached 2 years at the University of Florida while we fought all these legal battles.
I did not realize that was going on during this time. I knew it was 05 because that's when you and I overlap. I'm at Mississippi State and you are at Florida. I have to imagine, not diving into all the kerfluff that was going on, but for a guy who seemingly really enjoys being on the track or the field with athletes and solving problems, all that side of things, the court side and all that stuff had to be some of the most, the least enjoyable time of your life. Like all that is the exact opposite of being on the track, helping people move better.
Well, I'll be honest, it was the first time I ever thought about leaving coaching.
Sure.
It's like, my whole life I've helped people, been honest, transparent, and then, this happens. And like, I'm not exaggerating. We were probably about 1.2 million in the hole with legal costs because this went through 4 or 5 appeals and all kinds of stuff. And then people declare bankruptcies and whatnot, and sponsors bail out, and you don't have the legal power to go after, a corporation like Nike. So basically, you're just left holding the bag. And I actually had to call Amy Acuff, the high jump gal that I was working with, and get a loan just so we could pay our rent for a couple of months. So it was pretty dire times, and it almost got me out of coaching.
Yeah, not sure anybody would have blamed you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you go to Florida, this is where you and I intersect personally. So I had been to some camps and clinics that you had been at and read a lot of your stuff. And at that time, I think 05, we're probably still VHS in it. So I probably watched a few VHS tapes that had you in. I'm in the 05 season. I'm in my second year at Mississippi State, coaching jumpers and helping with the sprinters. And we go to SECs at Vanderbilt. And you had a really fantastic athlete. I believe his name was Mike Morrison. I believe he was the long jump, triple jump, and high jumper. Was it Mike Morrison? Yeah, from Jersey, of course, of all places. I just love Jersey athletes. It's quite phenomenal, the athletes that come out of that state.
Well, he was also a 45-point relay guy.
Oh, I don't think I knew that. Oh my gosh. So we're at Vanderbilt for SECs. And I don't know, you've been to so many tracks, you are completely forgiven for not remembering this. The long jump was over by the chain link fence outside of the track, and the trees were not cut. So like there was a branch like right at the penultimate for the long jump. It was just terrible. But we're having this battle long jumping, and my kid, Christopher Lewis, who was like a 19-foot kid out of high school, love Christopher Lewis, a genius guy. He takes the lead. Mike Morrison comes. It was really unkind to Mike Morrison because he was also high jump at the same time. So he was running back and forth. Mike took the lead or put pressure. Well, all said and done, my kid from Mississippi State ends up winning. I think Mike was second. I think my other kid was fourth. And that was phenomenal. That was my first SEC champion for like my own, like I'd helped Dudley and the crew with the sprints, and we had some amazing sprinters there, but this was my first, like, okay, I took over all of Christopher's training, and we won a long jump title. It was amazing. Right. And I'm just so pumped. I'm so excited. Kendall Pint's the kid who got fourth for me. It was just, we were all happy. And then Dan Pfaff, you purposely walk over to me extend your hand and say, hey, congratulations. And Dan, I know it's hard to think about when you're in the moment and who you are, and you're so humble that sometimes maybe you don't remember. I think you honestly think of yourself as Mr. Dan. You're like, I'm just Dan Pfaff, and I'm just Mr. Dan. I just help kids. But when you came over to me, when you purposely came over to me, that was what was very succinct for me. It wasn't like we passed each other and you fist bumped me. You came over to me and shook my hand and said, hey, congratulations. That is one of the top moments of my coaching career, my friend. Because here was this guy that I looked up to. Here was my Mount Rushmore of coaches who easily, you didn't have to come over. You didn't. You probably had somewhere else to go. Mike Morrison probably had another event to do. The humility, the humbleness that you showed by coming over to a young coach and saying congratulations and shaking my hand, it made me feel on top of the world. It gave me so much, not credibility. What's the word I'm thinking here? Confidence. It's like, oh my goodness, maybe I actually can do something in this world. I don't know if I can become a Mr. Dan, but maybe I can be something in this profession. It was, it's a memory. I mean, that was 2005. So we're getting close to 20 years ago. That's how old we're getting, Mr. Dan. It's quite amazing. And I remember every second of that film, if you will, of my life that happened, man. So I don't know that I've ever gotten a chance, and I'm so humble that I get to do this publicly right now. Thank you so much. Here's what I know. I know I'm one of like 1,000 coaches that have a story like that you have touched other coaches, young coaches' lives in such an easy manner, right? You didn't come over and say, if you would do your penultimate this way, he would have jumped X, Y, and Z, or hey, blah, blah. It was just a gratitude, a thankfulness, a humbleness to say congrats. And it meant the world to me, my friend. And I'm just so proud that I get to like publicly thank you. I get to represent thousands of other coaches that right now are going, oh yeah, Dan did that to me too. And Dan did this. And if Dan wouldn't have told me this, or if Dan wouldn't have spent time with me after this clinic, I wouldn't be who I am today. It's kind of a cool little thing being the host of this podcast that I get to like publicly represent thousands of people that you have positively affected, really around the country, not or around the world, not just the country, man. So thank you so much for your humbleness there.
Well, thanks for saying that. You never know how you're going to touch people, and it doesn't always have to be elaborate or whatnot. And maybe I'm a little bit old school, but I think sportsmanship is an important component of sport and coaching. And there's probably a few guys I wouldn't shake hands with because of how they've done it. But if someone did it right and they kicked my ass, then you should congratulate them.
Yeah.
I mean, they beat you.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, half the reason I wanted you on the podcast was so I could publicly tell you thank you, man. It really was. It was, like I said, it's a moment nearly 20 years ago that I'll never forget. I'll never forget that you came down to my level and said, congratulations, man.
Well, hopefully, some of the takeaways for people on this will be that, hey, words matter, a conversation matters, and, a few words can change a person's career or life.
Yeah, absolutely. And you did. It's amazing. Okay, you're at UF. You're with Mouse, one of my favorite people. Guest number 30, by the way, on the Gill Connections podcast. Just a humbling man who really has, you think about 05 Mouse to 2022 Mouse. He's got a few more rings and a few more Olympians and records. And since then, he's done an amazing job. And you go back and listen to his podcast if you're listening today, because again, a lot of mentors that poured into his life. Again, we don't do this on our own. We do this on the shoulders of others. And Mouse is certainly one who has transitioned from being on the shoulders of a lot of people to now having a lot of coaches on his shoulder as he mentors people around the world, really around the country and around the world. So how long at Florida, as you're going through this just utter crap through the court systems, does it renew anything? Because you talked about, there was a heartbeat there about maybe getting out of this coaching profession. Did it bring back any passion, or how did that go there in Gatorland?
I was probably in a fog, so it was kind of doing things by memory or whatnot, and probably didn't do. It's probably not my best 2 years of coaching. Um, Miles was super understanding and supportive, and gave me a lot of latitude. Things that stood out from Miles is he developed a very defined culture and accountability, and was super organized, and so it was easy to operate in the fog in that construct. But I would say my 2 years there, I was kind of in a fog. I was trying to hold a marriage together and try to avoid bankruptcy, and I was flying in and out for court appearances, and still coaching a few pro guys on the side and whatnot. And I'd really say some of the key athletes of Florida and some of the key pro people that I was coaching really kind of pulled me out of the really deep, dark hole that I was in.
Yeah, we talk about stressors for athletes and how it can affect performances. Well, we forget that, coaches are humans too. And so you've got all these stressors just beating you from the outside. It kind of makes you not want to go to work that day. And what motivation do you have to continue to educate yourself and get better? It's like, man, I'm just trying to wake up tomorrow morning at the end of the day, Yeah, it's
Yeah,
tough.
I would kind of call those 2 years there as tread water years, like hopefully I didn't do extreme harm, but it really wasn't my 2 best years of coaching by any stretch.
You kind of look back and think, man, I could have done X, Y, and Z. I just wasn't in the.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's too bad. What happened after those 2 years?
Well, so then we moved to the Bay Area. Amy Cuff and Susie Powell had befriended a builder, a construction tycoon that was developing a training center in the Bay Area.
Right.
And at the time it was called Tiger Bar.
Yes.
And so we developed a small training group out there, had people like Amy and Susie and Ty Harvey, Amy's husband, and Brad Walker came in, Tommy Skipper came in, Nikki McEwen and Becky Holiday came in. So we probably, Brian DeCuna, probably had a group of about 12 athletes training in a kind of a warehouse on an island.
I remember. Yeah, I do.
Rio Vista, California. And then unfortunately, the housing collapse occurred right as we were getting started. And so the builder kind of had to pull away and we were left floundering. And so we ended up with a pole vault club in the Bay Area. And they had connections in Stockton. So we rented a warehouse in the port of Stockton, an old naval warehouse. And Ty Harvey got AstroTurf from the Olympic Training Center, and we built runways and tracks in this big, huge naval warehouse and built pole vault runways and long jump runways. And it was cold as balls in there in the winter. And we had a dining tent. We wrapped it in plastic with a space heater, and you'd go in and warm up and then jump out. And we had space heaters at the end of the pole vault runway to warm your hands. And Ty had set up all these security cameras. So we had cameras from every perspective, all synced. So it was kind of cool. I can't remember the year on that, but we put quite a few people on the world team then. I think it was Osaka. And so that was kind of a 3-year detour to the Bay Area. And then from there, I segued to running the Olympic Training Center in San Diego. The USOC had overtaken it from the Federation, and I was hired by the USOC to kind of run the program. And successful gig there. I think the most they'd ever had on a national team before us was 3 or 4 athletes, and we put 8 on the Olympic team that year.
I didn't remember Chula Vista. I remember the Tiger Bar because I remember driving out. You said an island. I remember that. It was kind of a winding, and I hadn't been to California very many times. And I remember I was in the car, around the corner as I'm traveling, and out of nowhere, there's this peacock. I mean, it was just like right there. And I was like, what in the world? Like, this is such a strange land out here in California, man. And then that's where I first met Brad Walker. You were working him out. He was doing, so weird how you remember these things. This single leg, had a barbell in his hand, single leg support, toe touch kind of thing. And you're like, hey, this is Brad Walker. And, he was University of Washington, or it was University of Washington, right? Yeah. And I was just like, it's like, what a life. I was like, I don't even know where in the world I am. And there's this awesome pole vaulter and Dan's here. Just a crazy, crazy time. I forgot about that. And you transitioned from there to Olympic Training Center. I don't know that I knew that. Was it still the Olympic Training Center, or was it the Chula Vista Training Center?
No, it was still the Olympic Training Center. USATF had a lot of management problems, so the USOC had taken it over for a year.
Oh,
I was
right.
hired by a guy named Jay Warwick. He was a portfolio manager for track and field, and I had Ty Saban on the staff, and Al Joyner, and who's a Brazilian 800 guy.
Not Juan Torino.
No, Cruz.
Cruz. Yeah.
And so, kind of managing that, and we kind of turned things around, reorganized, financially got solvent and have you. And I think that was 2009, if I remember right. So that was German world champs.
Yeah, I was thinking Tiger Bar was around 2008 for me when I went out there, because I think I was out there for Sacramento for either USA's or NCAA, something for Sacramento, and then came out that way, or flew in a different place. So around 2009. I remember the Olympic Training Center. I used to do the juniors high hurdle camps out there for USATF, and just always thought what a beautiful area and could thrive, and just never got going. So it was kind of good to hear that you kind of brought them into solvency, and really they had some good years, even through Chula Vista taking over, and Chris Mack and the crew really doing a good job with a lot of Team USA people, team members coming out of those groups.
Yep.
So at this time, you go through Tiger Bar, which is kind of this, not kind of, it's a private coaching. You go to the Olympic Training Center, which is more public coaching, but it's not university bound. Is there any tug at university to pull you back? Or are you happy with where? Not at all. You're happy with where you're going at that point?
Yeah, so I've always kind of been a coach / therapist, and holistic and all of that. And the NCAA rules are just getting more and more ridiculous. So really, the toolbox that I'm good at, half the tools I couldn't use in the university setting. So really, I didn't see it as a viable option.
Yeah, that makes sense. What comes after Olympic Training Center? Is this when Altus comes into the picture, or World Pro Center?
What happened then, the USA Track and Field threatened court action against the USOC. So USOC gave it back to USA Track and Field, and I wasn't going to work for those guys for a lot of reasons. Sure. And so longtime friend Charles Van Comenie had just been appointed head coach for the UK track program in the 4-year lead up to the home Olympics. And they were in San Diego for a training camp, and Charles and I went to dinner. He goes, "What's up?" And I said, "Well, I'm looking for work." And he goes, "I got a job." And I was like, "Doing what?" And he goes, "Well, we need somebody to run the London Training Center. We'll make you training center director, and you're in charge of all these people, and you got 80 athletes, and we got 3.5 years to figure this out, and you're the guy." And I was like, "Well, there's no way my wife's moving to England, and
right.
I have no desire to live in England or whatnot." But I tried a couple other projects, and I was coming up dry financially. And then he stayed after me. So we'll write up a contract. So he's a close friend. We'd collaborated on athletes for years out of Holland and whatnot. And so I wrote up this incredible contract that I knew no one would buy, and they bought it. He called me, said, "Get on a plane. It's done deal." And I was like, "Oh, shit." So
I think there's a lesson of be careful what you ask for.
Yeah. So I land in London, and I had a PA, and she, in a previous visit, she'd set up a driver and all this stuff. So I land, and I got my bags, and I'm like, "Julie, there's no driver." She goes, "Oh, we rented you a car." And I was like, "What?" And I said, "I've never drove a right-hand car on the left side of the road." She goes, "Oh, you'll figure it out." So I go into the car rental place, and it takes me an hour to get the car out of the parking spot, because
Lord,
I'm doing all these 3 points, and the car's stalling. It's a stick shift. I drove manuals, but not on that side. And then I get out and there's a roundabout and they don't have directions. It's just cities. So if you don't know the cities, you don't know what exit out of the roundabout. So I'm calling her, pulling off. Took me like 3 hours to get to my apartment that she had rented for me. And so that was my introduction to UK living.
Did it make you long for the highway system of Houston?
Yes.
Oh, Lordy. So what did you do? Is this when you met? Because I know you worked with Steve Lewis for a while. Is this where Steve Lewis came into the picture as you're working with UK and London athletics?
So basically my role was to be center director. So coordinate and oversee and be the gatekeeper for sports medicine and sports services and coach development and athlete monitoring and all of that. It was a performance directorship. Mm-hmm. And then Charles and I have a meeting. He goes, we got about 6 or 7 athletes that are injured or troubled children that nobody wants to coach. And I think you could help these people. And I was like, great. And so I got people like Steve Lewis, pole vaulter, Goldie Sayers, British record holder in the javelin, Rob Tobin, who was a 400 relay guy, and Reese Williams, 400 hurdler, some sprinters like Dwayne Chambers, Marlon Devonish, Christian Malcolm. And so it's the story of my life. I get the lost, the homeless, and the broken. And, so I ended up, part of the day I'm center director and part of the day I'm personal coach to these people.
Mm-hmm. Is that part of your spectrum that you like, though, when you talk about the broken and the,
well, like I said, I'm the underdog guy. So
yeah, right. Yeah. The guys who aren't supposed to do it anymore.
So like, one of the most profile people was Greg Rutherford. So Olympic champion, world champion, Commonwealth game, Euro, whatever. Mm-hmm. And so he came to me at age 23 and his injury report was amazing. Like 17 hamstring tears on one leg, 15 on the other, 3 foot surgeries, like health problems out the yazoo. And, nobody wanted to coach him. And he was averaging maybe 2 or 3 meets a year. So like kind of get well, do a meet, get re-injured. And so, he was probably one of the most lost, broken athletes that I, helped resurrect, with the team around me. It was definitely a team project.
And all that run through the 12 Olympics?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What happens after that, though? Because this whole thing was for the 12 Olympics, right?
Yeah. So tremendous experience and whatnot, and totally burnout. Like I think everybody involved in that project had health problems for about a year or two after. It was just combat fatigue, post-traumatic stress disorder, because you're fighting all kinds of stuff, gender and misogyny and politics and it was a war on a lot of fronts, silos and power struggles and whatnot. So my plan was financially, it was a lucrative gig and I was going to take a year off, kind of catch my breath, do a little consulting there. And John Gadina called me and he'd started the World's Throws Center there in Phoenix and was looking to expand and wanted to expand kind of into the jumps and the combined events and asked me if I had an interest. And I was like, I really need a breather. And he said, well, write up the contract. And I wrote it up and he said, okay. And I was like, oh, shit. So I started doing the commuter marriage routine, like 3 weeks in Phoenix, a week back in Austin, back and forth. And so that the World Athletics Center eventually morphed into Altus, is what you see today. So we envisioned it as a coaching resource center and a home for athletes, for athlete development and network collaboration.
And it's amazing that transition. We had John on the podcast not too long ago, last season. John became just a very close friend of mine through World Throw Center. I don't know how many people even know the history of Altus, because Altus has done so well under Altus, but World Throw Center, World Athletics Center, and then transformation at Altus. You might be. Maybe you and Andreas, are you two the only people still from the original from way back? Because Stewart
Well,
came in a little bit
it
later.
was kind of a journey. Like John contacted me, and he'd also been talking to Andreas, and
Hmm.
then Stu and Kevin were kind of in there. So
Yeah, a little
it
bit
was
later.
kind
Yeah.
of in a year period of time where all the satellites came to roost in Phoenix.
Yeah, yeah. And now in Atlanta, for crying out loud, that's amazing on its own thing. Stewart is doing an amazing job. That whole crew is quite amazing. So talk to us about, what do you do for Altus? You know, you guys have become, when I mentioned coaching education not too long ago, I would have said, for formal coaching education, I'd have said USATF level 1s, level 2s, USTF CCCA, through the academy with Boo running through that. And then I would have stopped and said, and then there's some private camps, clinics, you know, those kind of things. But today, now when I mention coaching education, if I ask someone, hey, what do you do for coaching education? I mention, you know, do you do USATF, USTF, Altus? I mean, there's a very formalized amount of education and mentorship. Let's make sure we talk about the programs you do there as well, that have come through there. Talk to us about building that and what the goals are for those programs.
Well, Kevin Tyler, when he was in the UK, was in charge of coach development, and he started the U Coach program, which was an online format for coaches all over the home countries and what have you. So there was in-person symposiums and workshops, but the bulk of it was online coach development.
Hmm.
And I'd worked with Kevin at the Canadian Coach Institute that they had there in Edmonton also. So Kevin had those two realms, you know, that he brought into the WAC at the time, which is now Altus. And so, like we said, we wanted to be a resource center for coaches. So we started the Apprentice Coach Week, where coaches could come out and spend a week and see what best practice looked like. And then we started building this online content. So, like, I was responsible for the high jump and the pole vault, and we got Boo to come in for the horizontals, and we got Don Babbitt to come in for the throw sections. And then Andreas did a hurdle thing, and then Stu's kind of gone into the need for speed kind of stuff for multi sports. And so it's really just, and back to the original, one of the original mission statements of, you know, being a resource center for coaches.
Yeah, it's quite amazing because, at least in my relatively short time with track and field, no one's been successful at creating a home base for coaching education. You know, USATF is, you know, level 1s around the country, kind of bringing the curriculum to others, and then, you know, kind of a once a summer hotspot for level 2s. USTF CCA is kind of the same thing. You know, a lot of different areas where they'll have academies. This was very much a, hey, we're going to have the resources here. You come in a week at a time for like the ACPs and things like that. That was pretty radical, maybe still radical today, but successful. Like today, like I said, you talk about coaching education, you have to put Altus in there. How was it from the get-go? How was the reception? Was there ever a moment of like, hey guys, this just isn't gonna work? Or was it always just dogged determination of like, this is gonna work if we keep pouring into it?
Well, I'd love to tell you we had a plan and that the plan's working, but in this internet age, there's a saturation of online stuff, and there's probably a saturation of, you know, internships and what have you. So, you know, we're in the midst of those battles. How do you separate yourself from the industry, so to speak? And how do you educate consumers to be more discriminating in their selection and whatnot? So those are a lot of the battles that we're currently fighting. Fortunately, we were early in, and so we've got a worldwide network of people that, you know, collaborate with us, that we brought in and are now part of the Altus family. And, you know, they're doing works related and unrelated, but tied to us. And so it's really a word of mouth marketing more so than, you know, we have a big social media footprint for sure, but, you know, most of our attendees, whether it's in the mentorship courses or the ACPs or whatever, is usually a word of mouth referral. The people had a good experience and, you know, can express why they had a good experience, and that encourages people to maybe spend time with us.
Well, and talk about that mentorship program, because it's one thing to do coaching education, and you certainly are doing some unique things inside of coaching education. I think about the fireside chats again, just kind of it's a formalized, informal way of doing it, which I love. I think that helps maybe kind of bring people's guards down, so they're able to ask the questions that sometimes they're afraid to ask. I love that aspect of it. But you're doing this. I don't know. I can only think of really one other aspect that I'm aware of. I'm sure there's something in the USATF, but in USTF CCCA, they have an amazing women's mentoring program where they put a female with another female mentor-mentee relationship, a formalized, like there's stages along the year. You guys are doing a mentorship program as well. And I think this is so important in our career. If you think about when you first started, when I think about when I first started, to have like a formalized mentor, like I'd have been a million times better than what I ended up in my career. Talk to us about that mentors program and your role within it.
Well, it probably starts with SWOT analysis. So what are your strengths, your weaknesses? What are opportunities and threats to where you currently exist? And then from there, you build out, encourage, I think a good mentor, it's not just one-on-one and it's back and forth, but they also build a network around people, in a diverse network. So a lot of our work is in, connecting people for areas that they have concern or interest or passion about, and then, alert them to blind spots. And so a lot of it's a continuous SWOT auditing process. We have different tiers. So we have small cohort meetings. We have, longer presentation discussion meetings and whatnot. So we try to have a lot of layers to where people can find some comfort to get transparent.
Oh yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's let's say that again, to where they can find comfort so they can get transparent. Yeah. That's really important. Taking away those our natural walls. We build up walls for a lot of different reasons. We're scared to talk to people. We're scared of looking like a fool. All those kind of things. How do we kind of strip those layers bare and realize that, okay, we're in a quote unquote safe place. We can talk and have insecurities here and help each other.
Yeah, well, we had an interesting debrief with one of our last mentorship groups. So we kind of went around the room and, said, like, what are your 3 big takeaways or experiences of the mentorship that really hit you? And a common theme came up, and this was primarily driven from the high school coaches we had in the mentorship, and they all, to a person, said, I was really interested in track and field, and in particular, my event area. But, now I'm in this mentorship, and we got rugby guys from Ireland and AFL football coaches from Australia and skiing coaches from Canada and whatnot. And I never realized how there were common denominators or common issues or problems or whatnot. And so it really brought down the curtain on a lot of the biases that people have. And, that's heartwarming when you get that kind of feedback, because that's one of our objectives, is to tear down some of these curtains.
It's easy for us to think, oh, where we're the only ones who have these problems. We're the only ones who have these struggles. And it's like athleticism, and again, human performance. How do you make a human better at skiing, Australian rules, etc.? A lot of commonalities in the issues that are dealt with.
And a lot of the common denominators is power struggles, control, communication, or things like programming. Like, how do you identify essentials? And how do you rank essentials? You can't train 8,000 things all at once on a given day. Right. So how do we rank these things and determine what day to do what? Programming is universal in sport. And, like one of the marathon coaches we had on, gleaned some incredible insight from in-season training by rugby coaches, how they look at things and how they match things together and whatnot. And she said, like, that was probably one of the most powerful programming sessions she had on the mentorship. And who would have ever thought a marathon coach listening to a rugby guy in Ireland, gained insight?
That's what exactly what I was going to say. Is like, I never would have guessed that a marathon would have learned anything from rugby, and vice versa, by the way. I was like, let me name two completely distant disciplines of athletics, and yet there was commonalities to learn from each other.
Yeah.
Wow. That's interesting. So what is your today? What's your percentage of how much are you actually coaching an athlete versus coaching coaches today?
Well, like I said, I have 3 direct Paralympic athletes that I coach directly. And they're the only ones outside the kids in the neighborhood that I'm helping, where I would call it direct coaching. Now, I do a lot of advisement, so I might have a coach that I've mentored and I'm helping them with an athlete, whether it's return to play or programming or whatnot. So there's probably about 20 to 30 coaches that I help, from that kind of perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's other coaches where, maybe not as frequent, but, monthly check-ins on their programming or, SWOT analysis on what's going on, or life management or power struggles or resources. Hey, I need some help in this area.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say probably advisement and mentorship is the bulk of the day, but then I do a lot of return to place work with pro athletes. So that kind of ebbs and flows. So someone coming off of surgery, I'm pretty heavily involved. We're doing Zoom practices and whatnot the first 6 months, and then it filters down.
So we have a pretty big listenership here, Dan, including Power Fives, D1s. Someone's going to hear this and be like, Dan, I've got a position for you here at XYZ University. What's the any shot at getting you back into collegiate coaching?
0.
All right, 0. All right, you heard it there. 0%. So everybody, put your phones down. Quit calling them right now. It's over. He's doing much bigger and greater things, I think, for our sport.
Well, I don't know about that, but like I said, the rules in the university or high school setting have changed so drastically that I don't know that I have the skill set or the energy to recreate, a coaching style that would fit in the confines of current dictates.
Yeah, I hear you. Okay, Dan. So we've got a few more minutes with you here. I'd like to, with your permission, I've got just kind of a list of topics, and a lot of them are topics that you have recently written blog posts about through Altus. And again, if you're not following Altus, if you're not on the newsletter, highly recommend you to go get this. If you want Dan to be a mentor to you and you don't have the resources to go out to Altus and get in the mentorship program, you kind of got a little mini mentorship through these blogs. It's kind of Dan, I don't know if this is the right term here, Dan, but kind of regurgitating the knowledge and experience that you've had over these years into written form. And it's really quite phenomenal. So with your permission, I'd like to kind of give a topic and let you just kind of riff on it a little bit, just to try to bring as much value to listeners out there. Does that work okay with you? I'm kind of blindsiding you. I didn't even bring that up really in our pre-interviews. Is that okay?
We'll give it a go. I like the free form.
I love it. That's how we work well together, Dan. That's exactly right. Okay. You recently had a nice perspective about work-life balance. What would you say, and I was guilty here, hand raised. There was no work-life balance when I was a coach. I'm not sure there's much. I'm better now, but definitely during coaching. And I think it showed. I had no serious relationships through a coaching. I was always in 10 years. I was at 5 different institutions. It was always move, etc. What do you say to coaches out there about work-life balance in general? I'm not even going to give an example of what maybe someone's dealing with. Just in general, what's your thoughts and feelings now looking back on a coaching career of so many successes, right? A lot of people would say, I want his successes. What is your thoughts on looking back now on work-life balance as a coach?
Well, I'm probably not the guy to talk to about this because I failed massively on that front. I think it's a bit of a myth that you can have work-life balance. I think it's kind of a roller coaster, if you will. You have periods where you're really enmeshed in work, and then you have periods where you should be enmeshed in your family and neighborhood and things like that. So to me, I didn't get on the roller coaster. I was just on a friggin' freeway or an Autobahn, and it was all about coaching and career and whatnot. I think it's about establishing boundaries and guardrails and having people in your network, accountability partners that let you know when you're going off track, or you're blinded, or you're too driven, or you need to step back and catch your breath. So a lot of my counseling or mentorship on that front is like, look at it as a roller coaster and learn how to ride the roller coaster. I think we go through phases in career development or living life or whatnot. Like when we're in the 20s, we're building our careers. So we're getting certifications and degrees, and we're those initial jobs, and we're our initial networks, and we're just all in, and it's all encompassing, and we're overwhelmed. We're having to write programs and politics and power control struggles and all of that. And you got to be immersed. And then in the 30s, the dust starts to settle a little bit. You're a little more secure in that, but you're expanding and you're growing. You're expanding the network and growing responsibilities in your toolbox and all of that. And then in your 40s, you can kind of catch your breath and maybe start to see that you're shortchanging your family a little bit, or the self-care just in there, and it comes on the radar. Maybe I should look at that. And then in your 50s, you're kind of secure in what you're doing in management. You're just doing tweaks and nudges and whatnot. And then in your 60s, you're kind of the wise old sage. So kind of my perspective, when I was in my 20s, I was kind of like the big brother to the athletes I was coaching. And then in the 30s, I was kind of like the crazy uncle. And then in my 40s, I was kind of like the young dad. And then my 50s, I was kind of like the old dad. And now in my 60s, I'm kind of like the grandpa. So I think we go through these phases of life and development and whatnot. But my best advice is to realize it's a roller coaster, and, set boundaries and guardrails and whatnot. And, it just be where you're at. If you're with your family and it's blocked out, be with your family, shut the phone off or whatnot, or go on a vacation. Or I think that while my kids were growing up, I think we went on 3 family vacations total. That's bad.
I like how you said that it's a roller coaster, and learn how to ride the roller coaster, right? There's rules and regulations for it. And so when is the right time to be immersed, and when is the right time to be shut off, and all the times in between that.
Yeah, I think there's some really good stuff coming out on self-care, whether it's executive burnout or coaches burnout. Like Cody Royal does a great job on coach burnout and what have you. And so there's a lot more information out there. Like I've developed a checklist on self-care that I kind of go through with people that I think they're struggling with burnout. And a lot of times it's just unawareness of the essentials of burnout and the tactics and strategies that counteract those burnout drivers. So I think, just like we are with mental health, I think we're slowly moving in the right direction with what I call coach self-care.
You mentioned guidelines and regulations, kind of adjacent to those topics that you just riffed on there. And I love that. So much value right there. You mentioned in your 20s, you were kind of the, big brother, 30s, crazy uncle. I just love that explanation there. What I see a lot with coaches, and again, no finger point, this is completely guilty. I did this as well. Coaching, you actually might be able to help me with this. No one else has been able to give me a third. There are 2 titles that I can think of in my experience that travel with us, professional titles, no matter where we go. One is coach, right? Your neighbors call you coach, and, gosh, I haven't coached in 17 years. I've been at Gill for 16 years, and I still get people that say, "Hey, coach." And it's a little bit like flattering. They're like, "Wow, you still think of me as a coach?" Because that's a very lofty title in my opinion, but it's also a little bit like I'm not worthy of that title anymore. But coach is one, right? Coach, again, neighbors, you go to buy a loaf of bread and the clerk's like, "Hey, coach," it kind of travels with you. And then the other title is doctor, right? You call your doctor, "Hey, Dr. John," or "Hey, Dr. Smith," that travels with you. If you're an accountant, You don't call your neighbor, hey, accountant Jim. If you're a business owner, you don't call them CEO Sally. You just don't. And what I've seen is because of that coaching role, and we have all these different roles, right? Father, mother, husband, wife, son, brother, sisters. We have all these roles. I've seen a lot of us put the coaching role as number one. So over self-care, relationship care, financial care, health care, et cetera. And with that comes along this relationship with athletes. And we had a coach last season that said, I want to be that coach that, God forbid if they need it, they can call me at 2:30 in the morning. And I cringed just a little bit. I understand where they're coming from, but I'm also like, really, are you the right person? Should they be? I mean, there's some learned helplessness here. Shouldn't they have their parent or trusted friend? Where do you sit with coach athlete relationship in regards to like all these hats and responsibilities and just overabundance of the coach versus a lot of other resources that we should have as people for help and friendships and things like that?
Well, I think that's probably down to your coaching methodology and your outlook and, your philosophy and whatnot. Most people will use the cliche, we want to develop an independent athlete, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or a less
Right.
dependent athlete.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my question is, what are you doing to foster that? And so, having the athlete know who to reach out to and when and how and whatnot is part of the educational process. But that said, I think coaches ultimately are the ultimate gatekeeper. We're universalists and we got the network and we've gone down the road and we have all these experiences. So people think like if it falls under the coaching umbrella, this is my go-to guide. So I think a lot of times it's just expediency response out of the athlete. Like, I could call our HR department, or I could call our sports psychologist, or I could talk to the ATC person I really get along with. But my problem is massive and it's unique and I'm special. So I'm going to go to coach. So I think it's probably an educational failure, to be honest, or an accountability failure, like, helicopter parents, parachute parents, like it's the same problem.
You could add in academic. So instead of going to the counselor, go to the coach first. A class is going to interrupt practice. Did you talk to your guidance counselor instead that you came to me? It's just amazing. First of all, I don't necessarily think all coaches are putting those hats on themselves. We as society and inside of our athletic departments and culturally are putting a lot of those hats on there too. I get a little cheesed off when a coach gets nailed in the media because one of the athletes, and this could be pro here, goes out and does something, steals a car. And it's like, well, if that coach, and it's like, really, you think the coach was okaying car theft? Come on. That was that guy or gal making that bad decision, not the leadership of the coach.
Well, I think as society, we have a problem putting certain professions on pedestals, like doctors make mistakes. Doctors don't know everything about everything or whatnot, but, or, economists or CEOs, we put these people on pedestals and we assume that they know everything about everything and they don't. And, that's the beauty of being immersed in the scientific process. I mean, basically, the scientific process is designed to prove that we don't know what we're doing, or what we thought was valid isn't valid, or whatnot. So I think we've kind of got this thing twisted around a little bit.
Okay, let's go back to mentorship here real quick. We talked about the mentorship program there that you're running with Altus. What do you recommend for coaches on how to get a mentor, whether it's through something much formal like you at Altus or the women's program through USTFCCCA? And an add-on to that is there an age and stage where we don't need a mentor? Like at your age and stage, do you have mentors? and kind of with that, or is it a transformation of, do you transfer from having a mentor to being a mentor? I gave you a lot there. Let me step back. Yeah.
I have a lot of mentors, and as I've aged, I've diversified the layers and the types. So I have mentors in radiology and surgery and, gait analysis. I have mentors in management. I have mentors in mental health issues, women in sport issues, so my encouragement is to reach out to diverse populations and diverse people. It's not always sport specific or what have you. Get multiple mentors, spiritual mentors, mental health mentors, relationship mentors. In this internet age, it's not that hard to see the umbrellas that exist out there. And you might get 10 no's, but all it takes is one yes. And I think it's how you present yourself and what you're chasing and what you're looking for. I get a lot of requests and I'm like, what's the issue? Where do you really need help? And then I'm like, time-wise, I'm a little bit jammed, but these two people are excellent. They're good friends, they're colleagues. They have space, maybe explore them. And if this isn't working after a while, get back to me. So, back to our delegation topic. So for me, one of the key components of mentorship is building these layers and diversities of mentorships or influencers, in your life.
That's pretty eye-opening, because I'm pretty myopic. When I think of mentors inside the coaching world, I think of other coaches only. I never thought about mental health professionals and people who have experience in women and gender issues and concerns. I never even thought about those as potential mentors for our track and field coaches as well.
Well, like one of the things that happened in the UK was social media explosion. So Twitter became huge. And Instagram became huge, and Facebook and YouTube videos. I mean, it just exploded. So we went from 0 to we had people, athletes on social media 8-9 hours a day. They were just friggin' fried. So we had to bring in experts on how to manage social media and, how to set boundaries and guardrails and time allotments and use and the perils of posting and how to be transparent but not too transparent and all of that. So I had no idea about social media. I didn't use a cell phone until the late 90s, so I wasn't the guy to ask.
That's funny you said that, because you are pretty prolific on Twitter. I'm a Twitter guy, so I'm always on Twitter, and I see you on there. I don't know if you use other social medias, but you seem to be a user of Twitter and a user in maybe in different aspects. I don't necessarily see you posting a lot, but it seems like you use maybe that for like a news resource and culture resource, if you will.
Yeah. Well, part of our marketing is to have a social media footprint at Altus. So I was kind of forced into it. And then once you get into it, it's like crack cocaine, you can't stop. So, but I find a lot of interesting, research papers presented or perspectives and whatnot. And, I'm very diverse, I follow certain immunologists and certain mental health practitioners and various coaches and coaching realms. So again, I try to stay pretty diverse and try to look at the other side of things too.
Yeah, I love it, man. I just go back to 2005 when we met there in Vanderbilt. I never would have, first of all, we wouldn't have guessed anything of Twitter because it didn't exist, but would not have guessed Dan Pfaff's going to be on Twitter all the time. You wouldn't have either. You'd be like, no, Twitter, what are you talking about?
I'm trying to reduce my addiction, but it's not easy.
I watched that documentary on Netflix, The Social Network, I think it was. And they talked about, what the social media networks do to get you on there. And I took all of my social medias, including my email. I consider that kind of a social media. It's just a different form of text messaging, which I think is social media. I think of podcasting as social media. So I kind of lump those all into one huge bucket. But I took all of them except for Twitter and turned off all notifications. I just don't have them pop up I'll check Facebook maybe once a day or twice a day, but I'm not going to get that, especially on weekends. I'm not going to get that notification. Twitter, because I use that as almost like a text message. That's why I get DM requests and conversations. That's what I like about Twitter, is it's more conversational than say on Instagram. So I do keep that notification on, but I have found myself, I don't know if I can quantify it and say that I'm happier or less stressed, but I grab my phone a lot, but I don't grab it as much as I used to, when every Instagram like would pop up, every Facebook comment would pop up. It seems to be, it's worked for me at least to kind of shut those down, except for one of them.
Well, it circles back to our discussion, guardrails and boundaries and whatnot. Like when I block my calendar, like the first thing I put in is my exercise routine. That's mandated. It's blocked. There's no excuse, not working around it. And some emergency may come in, but I just slide it down. It doesn't disappear. And then I have reading blocked out. And then I have half-hour emails in the morning, half-hour I have social media for an hour here and an hour here. So I just blocked that out, and I'm pretty good about sticking to the plan.
Yeah. Wow. That's pretty disciplined.
Well, I grew up in a German household, so no choice.
Yeah, right. And on the farm, there's no choice of when things got to get planted and when they got to be picked up. Yeah. All right. A few more questions here, Dan. I love you, man. Thank you so much for this. There's so much value here. I'm just in awe here. Recently, you had a blog post, and I think I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, so you correct me and give us the information here. I believe you hypothesized on, is coaching worth the grind? And I can't remember if those were your exact words. Do you remember that post? And
no, I don't.
Let's see. It's not. I didn't do my research very well.
Any profession that you're in, like we said, it's a roller coaster. And so I always did a SWOT analysis at the end of the year. I'd write a list of the positives and a list of the negatives. And when the negatives really outpaced the positives, it was time to move on or change operating procedures. So I kind of don't like the word grind. A lot of times social media, I get overruled on what the title is or the concept because they got to get clicks or what have you.
Right.
But to me, when people use the term grind, they're probably early or mid-stage burnout. So to me, when I hear grind, it's kind of a red flag. And in essence, it tells me you're struggling with management.
I heard we're bringing in something to our workplace here at Gill. It's from a author. Have you heard the author Patrick Lencioni? 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, Ideal Team Player. He's got a new one called The 6 Types of Working Genius. And he had this analogy about burnout. And it really was a different way of, thinking and looking at it, for me at least. When we hear burnout, we think about, here, at least in the professional side of life, we think about burnouts like, oh, well, then give them extra days off, let them get away from the office, etc. And he used the analogy of a car running out of gas. That's kind of a burnout-ish type of analogy, right? And he said, when a car is running out of gas, you don't park it on the side of the road and that's how it fuels back up. You give it more fuel, you give it the thing that it needs. And so some people are coming close or experiencing burnout, and you give them a few days off. Well, that's the exact opposite. They don't want to be sitting around not doing, they need to be doing more of what they love. And that's kind of where his working genius assessment comes in, of like, here are things that are your God-given wired to love, and it gives you energy. And here are the things that sap you away from energy. It's not, you can't burn out when you're doing things you love that are giving you energy, but you can when you're doing the other things. I just think about that burnout of like, with coaching, it's hard because it's hard for us to take days off, but then so is it a shifting of priorities or shifting of responsibilities amongst the coaching staff and all the, again, the many hats you wear? Is there a way to take off some hats and give it to someone who loves that aspect, and you go over here and do the things that they don't like to do, and that can maybe stave off a burnout?
Yeah, and that's why I keep saying it's a management puzzle and problem. It's a tug of war between, polarities, if you will. And we're shit at our laundry list of self-care, like social interaction. Do you have time for a coffee with a friend? Or, can you do a weekend group thing with your neighbors or whatnot? How do you recharge? How do you refuel and how do you reduce psychic vampires and energy drains and stuff like that. But that's all a management puzzle, eh?
Yeah, I don't think we're very good at that. And I don't know if it's something that people who are inclined to be coaches aren't very good at, or if it's part of the profession that makes us not very good at it, but it's a bad combination.
Well, I think there's a helper gene in us as coaches.
Certainly.
We want to serve and help and whatnot. And if you look at the helping professions like nurses and psychologists and psychiatrists and police and fire, the burnout rates are off the chart. And it's probably driven by this huge desire, this underlying driver of helping people, but we don't know how to help ourselves.
Yes. Yeah. Very true. Very true. Okay, Dan, we alluded to it earlier. Some of the top coaches, and you can't really say that until they get near the end of their career because of their whole body of work, but Brooks Johnson, Boo Schexnayder, yourself, you are what we would call a generalist. You're a track and field coach. You're not a hurdles coach. You're not a distance coach. You're not a sprints coach, throws coach. Brooks kind of described it as every event is kind of the same. You're just moving the center of mass, center of gravity. And some you do it doing circles, some you do it down a runway, some you do it around the track, etc. Some you do it for a marathon. It's just a biomechanics issue of how you're doing it and the most efficiently. And again, guilty here, hand raised. I wanted to be, when I got into coaching, because I fell in love with the hurdles, I took a little offense when someone was like, "Oh, you're a sprints coach." I'm like, "Oh, no. I'm a hurdles coach. I might coach the sprints, or I might coach the jumps." In fact, when I went to go do my first level 2, I wanted to do sprints and hurdles because I was a hurdles coach. That's what I wanted to go do. And Mike Korn calls me up and says, "Hey, the class is sold out, but I do have a spot in the jumps." And I was like, I coach that, but man, that's my secondary. I'd really want to do sprints and hurdles. And Mike tells me, he goes, "Hey, you'll trust me, you'll get a lot out of it." It was taught by Boo Schexnayder, of course. So, I'm so thankful that I did, that I did that. But what is your advice to coaches, whether they're getting into it today, maybe they're 10 years, even 20 years, and they're the sprints guru or they're the throws guru? What's your advice about being a track and field generalist? I love that term you put in there, versus the hyper focus, go 20,000 leagues under the sea on one specific area of track and field.
Well, I don't think it's a simple linear equation. I think there's periods where we need to be specialists, like that roller coaster that we talked about. I mean, there were years where I had a great throws group, and I biased a lot of my reading, my research, my energies, my passion into the throws. It didn't mean I turned my back on the other events. It's just, I put more time and energy into that group. So it's a little bit of a roller coaster. Like I said, I've had years where I was known as a jumps coach. I've had years where, oh, he's a sprints coach. Oh, he's, a throws coach. No, he's a hammer coach. No, he's a javelin coach. Like in the UK, when I started coaching Goldie Sayers, the throws community was up in arms. Like, what's this friggin' sprints guy doing coaching the javelin? So I think it's kind of like work-life balance. I think there's this juggling act between specialization and generalization. And I think it's dangerous to be at either pole.
So you expound on that just a little bit. You're saying you think it's, if the two poles are, I am only going to focus on learning and becoming the best sprints coach in the world, versus I am going to learn every single event out there. You're saying the polarities, being on the complete far side, is wrong. Again, that spectrum, we keep bringing that in there. You think more inside of the spectrum?
Well, time of year, stage of development, and the athletes you have, the environment you're working in, and whatnot. I think we just need to realize we're going to slide on that spectral scale, kind of like a volume knob. And there's certain periods of our career and time with unique athlete groups where we may be more specialist than others. But, the danger of being a generalist is you really don't get deep into the layers of an event. So, I'm biased to being a generalist.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, also pretty curious. So, like our example with Tori Janssen, like, hey, for 6 months, I was friggin' driven to figure out the hammer. So I was super event specialist, but I was also the field events coach, the head women's coach. I had to coach in a lot of other events. So I had to kind of adjust that volume knob day to day or week to week or cycle to cycle. And so, like, one cycle, Tori's like, I need to spend a lot of time in the weight room, not so much time on the cycle. So then I could go back to being more of a jumps coach or whatnot. So this is what I mean about environmental constructs really kind of dictate how we slide that volume bar.
I love it. All right, Dan, my last question for you, sir. I have done almost 190 interviews now through the Gill Connections podcast. I've never asked this one question.
Great.
What is something that I didn't ask you that I should have?
Whoa, that's a good one. I have to think about that. I really don't have an answer. I'll probably ponder that one and get back to you.
We may do, because we're recording this earlier than when you're listening to it now, dear listener. So I just wanted to make sure, Dan's fountain of knowledge, and that is a big old fountain here. We don't get these opportunities very much. And I'm so glad that we had this opportunity today, Dan. And so I wanted to make sure, again, because your knowledge level is, unbelievable for a part of the area that I'm so passionate about, and that's coaches. And so I just know that there's been you've done 1,000 interviews, you have talked to 1,000 people, you've asked questions. Think about that, and if there's something that you're like, what, Mike, it's something that coaches need to hear, X, Y, and Z, get back to me. We might jump on and get 5-10 more minutes to add to the end of this. So
It's a light bulb went off.
All right, let's go. I knew it.
State of sport.
Okay. What about it?
In society today.
Yeah, tell me more.
So early specialization, the club teams and getting away from schools, the university chaos with the Super 50 schools and the NIL and people transferring and transfer portal and, the reduction of competitive opportunities in track and field worldwide because of financial stressors and, world politics and boycotts and whatnot. It's truly an earthquake moment in sport for me. I've never seen so many confluences interrupting or affecting sport and the execution of sport, in my 68 years of living.
Where does it all go?
I have no idea.
We need leaders like you, and as important, leaders like you have built and are building to set us on the right path.
Well, and some of it is, usually when there's existential crises, there's wise sages or mentors or, pillars of experience that can kind of guide the boat. But guys my age, we're at a tremendous disadvantage because we didn't grow up in the informational age and in the social media influence and the politics that are moving and how money is morphing sport. Like, we don't have the background in that. And so that's why we need to network and bring in multi-generational analyses and expertise for this puzzle. So like this NIL thing, is bizarre, and, transfer portal, I had one coach had 14 athletes in the transfer portal, and then 7 realized they weren't getting a look and they begged to come back, and they'd already filled scholarships. And I've never seen this kind of chaos.
I think that's the right word, chaos.
And then the high school coaches, I'm friends with a lot of high school coaches in the area, and my neighbor came over, 14-year-old daughter, volleyball rock star, and asked me, should we dump the school program and just have her stay in this really elite club? And, I said, well, what's the end goal? And it's scholarships and all of that. And so, even at this level, at the neighborhood level, we're wrestling with some major philosophical issues.
And to your point about guys in your age and stage, and I would put myself in this age and stage with you. When we grew up, especially where you grew up in your area and where I grew up in small town Alabama, what do you mean not play for your high school team? That's the only option you have, is to play with your, if you're not playing in the streets with your friends, you're playing for the high school or the middle school team. There's no clubs, there's no elite travels. It boggles me when I hear that type of situation. It's like, what do you mean you don't play for your high school team? Like,
So
non-starter.
I've got a case study of one. I'm helping this Major League Baseball pitching prospect, local neighbor friend. 17 years old, 6'5", 200 pounds, throwing over 100 miles an hour, can throw over 90 with 4 different pitches. He's a rock star.
Oh, man.
Well, he's got a pitching coach, a batting coach, a strength and conditioning coach. He's got a soft tissue therapist. He's got a chiropractor. He's got preschool practice. He's got post-school practice, all this. And, they came to me and said, like, we're stressed out. And I was like, yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
At 17, this guy's got a bigger team around him than I've got guys in the Major League Baseball. And they're having to make decisions on how to use what, when, and how.
Right. Wow.
Like when I came home with a complaint about my coach, my dad said, well, you got 2 choices. Do what he says or quit.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
It was pretty simple.
Pretty simple. Not a lot of stress back then on that regard. Yeah. What will my physio think? Yeah, I had no physio. What are you talking about? Oh man, Dan, we're at time, man. Thank you so much. Again, one of my really, it's a responsibility of mine. I represent thousands of voices right now that don't get a chance to talk to you, to email you, but owe so much to you and are just so thankful for some things that they know directly. So it's something as direct as, my experience with you is, coming up and finding me and shaking my hand and saying congratulations, to indirectly, they don't even realize, again, I didn't realize the influence you had over my dear mentor, friend, just everything, my pillar, everything that you mentioned, Boo Schexnayder's. I mean, if there's people not like you, there's not a Boo in the form that he is today. If there's not people like Coach Tellez, there's not a Dan in the form of today. So, it's a real humbleness here that I get to represent thousands of people and tell you, thank you, from direct help with the X and O and Y of coaching to the how do I be a coach? How do I be a person who chooses to be a track coach with work-life balance and just life in general, man? I'm just so thankful and just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart and the bottom of many, many people that right now they're shaking their heads and telling you through me how much you mean to them. So thank you so much for what you have done, what you are doing, and what's amazing is you're still doing, my friend. It's quite a journey that isn't over. We're not at the end of the book here, my man. You are still writing your journey, and I'm just so proud of you and so happy for you and so thankful for you.
Well, thanks for having me. And it's a little bit of a cliche, but it truly does take a village. So let's build a great village.
Absolutely. Amen. I love it. That's the mic drop right there. That's the end of it. Dan, thank you so much, man. Have a great rest of your day. I appreciate you more than you'll ever know, friend. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir.